Welcome back to the Fulton County Gospel News Podcast. My name is Barry Odell, and I am your host. Fulton County Gospel News is a bi-monthly publication of the Church of Christ in Mammoth Spring, Arkansas. And if you'd like to learn more about the paper, visit our website, mammothspringchurchofchrist.com, and you can find all the necessary information there. And you can receive the paper in one of three ways. You can receive it as a PDF in your email, you can receive a hard copy of the paper through the United States Postal Service, or you can receive a bundle of the papers through the Postal Service, and you can pass them out at your congregation. All of that is free of charge. Let us know what we can do for you, and we'll be happy to add you to our mailing list. Today I want to hit an article from the February 1986 edition of the Fulton County Gospel News, and the title of the article is The Restoration Plea, and the author was Bobby Dockery. I guess I want to start out by defining the term restoration. If you look that term up in the dictionary, it's something along the lines of the process of returning something to its original owner, place, or condition. And typically when we think of restoration, we think of restoring an old vehicle or perhaps restoring a house. Well, in the spiritual realm, there is this concept of restoration. We find it in the Old Testament particularly, and we find it in the books of the Kings and Chronicles throughout the history of the divided kingdoms of northern Israel and southern Israel, or Judah. Most of the kings of those kingdoms were evil, but there were a very few, approximately 8, in the southern kingdom of Israel, Judah, who were known as restorers, men who wanted to get back to God, get back to the law of Moses, men like Hezekiah and Josiah, among others, who did everything that they could do to be faithful to God. And so the concept of restoration, well, I guess you could also look at the books then of Ezra and Nehemiah, but the concept of restoration then, the point being, is a biblical concept. We want to restore something to its original place or condition. Well, in our context, we're talking about Christianity. Now, there's a very common misconception about the churches of Christ I want to address briefly, and that is that the churches of Christ in America are nothing more than a product of the late 18th, early 19th century American Restoration movement. Well, there's a couple of problems with that. Like I said, I'm not going to go into great detail, but here's what I'll hit on. Number one, so people say that's where Churches of Christ originated. Well, there is historical documentation that Churches of Christ existed before Alexander Campbell came to America. I know that's typically the name that is connected with the American Restoration Movement and the Churches of Christ, or Barton Stone, or something along those lines. There is historical documentation, both in Europe and other foreign countries and in the United States of America, that Churches of Christ existed not only before these guys got here. So, for instance, Alexander Campbell came to America in 1809, but there were Churches of Christ in existence here before he was not only got here, but before he himself was even born. So when people make that argument that the Churches of Christ are products of the Restoration Movement of America, number one, it shows that they really don't know their history. And number two, it shows that they know just enough history to be ignorant. And so that's about all I'm going to say of that. And I want to deal with this article because the author makes 5 points here. In a couple opening paragraphs, I'm not going to read the entire article, but in the 2 opening paragraphs, he talks about the religious movement that took place in Kentucky and West Virginia, and obviously there were other states involved wherever these men traveled who, now we need to understand this too. Okay, so the names I mentioned, Alexander Campbell, Barton Stone, Thomas Campbell, okay, Alexander's father, these men came from a variety of religious, of denominational backgrounds, okay, Methodism, Presbyterianism, Baptist doctrines. We have to be honest and informed enough to know and to admit these guys came with some baggage. Let's say it that way, spiritually speaking. They came to this concept of restoration with a lot of baggage. They came to this concept of restoration, of going back to the Bible and the Bible alone, with a lot of baggage, a lot of doctrinal baggage. And that shows through their preaching and writing that they were struggling within themselves, among one another too, but particularly within themselves of, okay, so here's where I came from, here's what we taught and believed, but now I'm just reading the Bible, and I can't find it. So one of those big issues, well, a couple of those big issues was infant baptism and instrumental music and worship. That was a constant struggle among those men again, within themselves, but then among themselves as well. So this concept of restoration is nothing new, and I think the 5 points that this author, again, Bobby Dockery, shared in the February 86 edition of Fulton County Gospel News are good for us to remember. So in terms of churches of Christ, let me say just a couple of things about that. I know most of my listeners are members of the church. There may be some who are not. When we talk about the churches of Christ, we are not using that term as a religiously divided title. Okay, so you have all these denominations that exist, and I mentioned a couple earlier. Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists, Catholics, the list could go on. And those terms, when they're used in the sense of a title. I am of the Baptist Church. I am of the Presbyterian Church. When we use the term Church of Christ, we need to understand, number one, that comes from the Bible. Romans 16:16 says, "And the churches of Christ salute you." And I understand, people make a big deal. Well, that's plural. Well, so what? Churches of Christ, Church of Christ, that's in the Bible. It's a biblical terminology. It's a biblical term. All these others that I've already mentioned are not biblical. They're associated with either men or particular forms of doctrine and practice. So we need to understand that, but we also need to understand when we're speaking of the church, we need to keep in mind the owner of the church. Okay, Jesus shed his blood to purchase the church, according to Acts 20 and verse 28. If we're going to claim to be a member of some religious organization, some church, we want to be sure that we're members of the one for which Jesus died. I don't want to be a member of some religious institution that was established by some man somewhere in the context of division from other men. And to associate myself with something like that would be to further division and further confusion, and I don't want to do that. So let's think about the restoration plea. I'll share with you these 5 points that the author gave us and then make a few comments. So point number one in talking about the restoration plea and calling for following biblical principles, his first point is this: the unity of all Christians on the basis of the Bible alone. And he writes, recognizing that real religious unity would be possible only when men would subordinate their own opinions to the authority of Scriptures, the restoration leaders resolved to speak where the Bible speaks and remain silent where the Bible is silent. 1 Peter 4:11. And listen, that's what the churches of Christ want to do today. Jesus said, all authority is given unto me in heaven and on earth. Matthew 28:18. And so we want to follow his teaching and the teaching of his apostles whom he directly commissioned. So number one, the unity of all Christians should be on the basis of the Bible alone. Number two, the rejection of all man-made creeds. And I guess in a sense that's really connected with number one. If we're going to go by the Bible alone, then we're not going to be referencing all the different councils and creeds and catechisms. Jesus tells us in John 12:48, we are going to be judged by his words. We're not going to be judged by Martin Luther's 95 Theses. We're not going to be judged by the various church councils throughout the 16th, 17th centuries during the Reformation movement. The writings of men like John Wesley and Martin Luther and John Calvin. We're not going to be judged by those things. So we reject man-made creeds, and the way you do that, again, goes back to point number one, is to find unity on the basis of the Bible alone. Number three, the use of only scriptural names in referring to God's people. So I touched on this a bit. So even in a small town like Mammoth Spring, where I currently reside, you drive down Main Street and even out of town a little bit, and you find a variety of religious groups calling themselves by different names. And so here's what the author wrote. Resolving to call Bible things by Bible names, those who were intent upon restoring New Testament Christianity called themselves not hyphenated Christians, but simple Christians only. And so I've used that term before, or that terminology before, hyphenated Christianity. What is that? Well, I'm a Baptist Christian. I'm a Methodist Christian. I'm a Catholic Christian. That is hyphenated Christianity, and that is division. It's divisive. The author goes on to say, it was talking about the restorationists, it was their intention to honor only Christ, not men or doctrines or practices, by the name which they wore religiously. Number 4, he talks about the recognition of the absolute autonomy of the local church. So when you get to scoping out the denominational world, you will come to realize that there are things such as the Southern Baptist Convention and the Churches of God Association, the Vatican. You have these different boards, councils, conventions, associations that are outside and bigger than a local congregation. Listen, when we look at the pages of the New Testament, we find local congregations who are under the oversight of the elders who were among them. 1 Peter 5, 1-4 talks about that. Acts 20, verse 28, when Paul was talking to the elders of the church at Ephesus, and them taking care of the flock of God that was among them. New Testament Christianity, when we're talking about the church, recognizes the fact that a congregation, a local congregation in a certain area, is self-governing, self-ruling. We don't have to look to Rome. We don't have to look to Salt Lake City. We don't have to look to the Southern Baptist Convention for what we're going to do, believe, practice, etc. We're going to go to the Bible. And then the 5th point that the author shared was this: the restoration of the government, worship, and terms of membership of the New Testament church. And he wrote, believing that the church of the New Testament provides a continuing pattern for the church as God would have it today, the pioneer preachers of restoration called for a careful reproduction of all the particulars of New Testament Christianity. The Restoration Plea found a receptive audience in frontier America. And listen, so he mentions that in one of these paragraphs. And it's interesting to note our national history here in America, where we were coming from. We were coming from the Church of England, and we were coming from oppression. We were coming from state-sponsored religion. And those men who were leaving that to come to the New World, they wanted to get away from that. And they found that freedom here in the United States of America. And so those who want to be members of, let's just say it this way, those who just want to be Christians, those who desire to know God, to love God, to serve God faithfully, they want to go back to the Bible alone. The author wrote this: those who are members of the churches of Christ continue to cherish the hope that they may be Christians only. In humility, they continue to plead for and seek the unity of a divided religious world on the basis of the Bible alone. In pursuit of that grand objective, those who are committed to the restoration of New Testament Christianity urge now more than ever that men and women of all religious persuasions resolve to examine their beliefs and practices with the intention of sincerely trying to speak where the Bible speaks and remain silent where the Bible is silent. And I thought that was a great concluding paragraph. That is all we want. I don't want division. Forget me. Jesus Christ does not want division. Not only did he not want division, but he prayed to his Father. Read John 17, verses 20 through 23. He prayed to his Father in heaven that those who believe in him would be one as he was in the Father and the Father was in him. Now, we know very well, if we're honest with ourselves, we know very well that does not accurately describe the current condition of religion in the world. There is so much division, so much strife, and not only that, what that produces is confusion among good people and honest and sincere people, but not only confusion, but frustration. I've run into people over the years who are like, I quit. I'm tired of it. I don't know what the right church is. There's so much division, and so I'll serve God on my own terms. Well, that's not the solution either. But division does not produce peace. Division does not promote spiritual growth and faithful service to God. The only way those things can be accomplished is by restoring New Testament Christianity, to return it to its original place, owner, or condition. And that's what we want. Let's just go back to the Bible. It's not that difficult. God has revealed himself to us in the pages of the New Testament. We can know his will. In fact, we're told, like for instance in the book of Ephesians chapter 5, that we should not be unwise, but we should understand what the will of the Lord is. I believe that's Ephesians 5:17. That is the plea of the churches of Christ. Let's understand the will of God and let's live accordingly. Well, I appreciate you tuning into this episode of the Fulton County Gospel News podcast. Again, if you're interested in the paper, visit our website, mammothspringchurchofchrist.com. If you've not yet done so, I would ask that you would become a follower of our Podbean channel. And when you do that, you'll get notifications of the new episodes that come out, and you can interact with each individual episode. Share this content on social media, on your Facebook page, or however else you can. We also have a YouTube channel where all of our content is uploaded. So anyway, thanks again for listening today, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fulton County Gospel News podcast.